It's interesting specifically with these mitzvot, again, that these are not, they're not just part of the covenant that Hashem is giving to his people. We're also being told these are things that when other people did them, that they somehow had this cocktail effect of blending into a big political problem for the Canaanim, like that Hashem doesn't allow them to hold on to the land, and that there may even be kind of a mechanistic relationship between these activities and their inability to hold on to the land. Like what made their society so brittle and dysfunctional that they could be conquered and expelled, that they couldn't hold on. And I think that what that draws our eye to is that we're not any longer thinking in individual terms for the moment and sort of saying, oh, what's really wrong with this? But it's more like, if this is in the drinking water, so to speak, if everyone is living in a society that normalizes a bunch of these practices at the same time, what is the effect of that? And that's really the question that the Torah seems to be drawing our attention to, especially, again, with this idea of to'eva, because to'eva is about national boundaries, national identity. It's about what is normalized for the group. And that becomes the fishbowl that everyone is swimming in. And that becomes the atmosphere that everyone is breathing, so to speak. And so then we're really interested in the collective behavior. Are there things about how the society coheres, about how the society behaves as a group that are going to be affected by whether this, that, or the other, or all of these practices are normalized or whether they are stigmatized? So one of the things we can look at before we go into narrative, because I think it will still be interesting to do that, is thematically, again, we listed a bunch of things. Most of them have in some way to do with sexuality. One I didn't mention before was making a harlot of your daughter. It also has to do with sexuality. So there's don't make a harlot of your daughter. I mentioned don't persecute strangers. That was the one that maybe doesn't obviously have to do with sexuality, but I think there's no question that it is adjacent to that insofar as immigrants who have no one to look out for them and protect them are very vulnerable to being co-opted into being enslaved and exploited in that way. And that happens in the present day, as everyone knows, with human trafficking. But in any case, so those are two. And then you have bestiality, incest. There was the prohibition of intercourse with menstruating women. There's the prohibition of male homosexual intercourse. And then we mentioned one that doesn't obviously have to do with sexuality, which is child sacrifice to the god Molech. So if you're looking for a consensus theme, and maybe the one about strangers doesn't quite fit there, I think one thing that maybe runs through all of them is unreproductive sexuality. And you have to kind of make that case carefully. First, let's deal with the child sacrifice one. There's a child, right? So there was sexuality that was productive, because otherwise there wouldn't be a child. But the point is, you're killing the child as a sacrifice to your false god. So you're cutting that line short. And in other words, you're creating a situation where, on purpose, there now was sexuality with no child ultimately. And obviously that's not the same thing as sexuality that is deliberately infertile. But I think we'll put it in the same category and say it is kind of, part of destruction of one's seed, so to speak. And that is indeed the language that's used, passing your seed through the fire to Molech when the mitzvah is talking about it. And then the rest of them are more obvious, right? That sex during menstruation is not reproductive. Male homosexual intercourse is not reproductive. Bestiality is not reproductive. When one's daughter is made into a harlot, the interest of a client, so to speak, who's using her as a prostitute is not to produce a child, but rather to achieve sexual gratification from the transaction. And so all of these things, they're not just about non-reproductive sex, they're about non-reproductive sex by men. that where the focus is in a sense on a male desire perhaps for sexual encounter without reproduction. And that, I think, is the thread that we want to chase, because that's not all the mitzvot that you find in Sefer Vayikra in 3 chapters. These are 3, 18 through 20, book of Leviticus. There's a lot that's in there, but and I didn't mention incest before, sorry, but incest is another example where it's a little dodgier. You have to work at it a little bit to make this case. But while it's true that incest is reproductive, what's also true is that incestuous relationships are biologically much more likely to be inviolable in some way. And there's a kind of a willingness to sacrifice the biological viability of reproduction for the sake of the sort of desire one has, right? That it's easy to imagine that someone who really wants more than anything to have a healthy child would not necessarily be drawn to an incestuous relationship, and that rather one is more likely to be drawn to an incestuous relationship if one is following one's appetite for the target of that amorous attraction. And so it's an incomplete case because it does produce offspring, but I think you can still fit it into that paradigm. So if we view all of those things together, then you could say, all right, so it's interesting that Sefer Vayikra is mentioning all these things together and is making a bunch of mitzvot, but what is the problem with that, right? If what we take out of all of that is, it seems like the Torah has a problem with non-reproductive male sexuality, and it has a problem with it at a political level, at a group identity level, right? Again, it's not, we know as a matter of practical halakha that there's lots of non-reproductive, like technically non-reproductive male sexuality that's totally permitted, right? A man, for example, may have intercourse with his wife when she's pregnant, and they're not going to produce another child that way. And there are a variety of other circumstances, right, where someone, a woman, for example, could be medically infertile. Let's say she had to have surgery to save her life, and afterwards she's medically barren. It's not now forbidden for her husband to have relations with her. So this can't quite be the case. It can't quite be the case that we're saying under no circumstances can men engage in sexual intercourse unless it always produces a child, because that's kind of crazy and not possible. So then, I think we need to get help from the fact that we also have detected in our source here already that this is about some kind of collective and political discussion more than it is about individual instances and cases, because those can always be kind of complicated by their particular details. So if that's what we're considering, then I think we're going to get help in understanding what the Torah may be driving at here by looking at a passage elsewhere in the Torah that deals with, surprisingly, all of these issues in narrative at once. So let's ask the question: can we think of a story somewhere in the Torah that brings in persecution of strangers, child sacrifice, pimping of daughters as harlots, incest, male homosexuality? I said all of them, but I'm mistaken. I can't find any connection to bestiality or one other of the list. But let's say there's still quite a few elements here that are going to line up. And I think that the examples of these other mitzvot, they just help to establish the theme more clearly in the halachic construct. So when we look at the mitzvot in Vayikra, we get the full list, and we see, you don't usually think of bestiality as a method of contraception. Again, we live in a world where technology and various other things, among other things, the percolation of Leviticus-inspired values into many societies for centuries makes bestiality seem very far removed from any kind of real possibility, thankfully, right? But at the end of the day, that is a possible sexual outlet for someone who's looking to have that without producing a child, as revolting as the idea may be. And so it presents itself as one thing in a list of many things that connect to this theme. So can we think of a story that has, the plurality of these elements, if not all of them? And I think the answer is yes. And that is the story of Lot's visitors in Sodom. So remember that Lot was the nephew of Abraham, who moves to Sodom because Sodom is a lush society with a great economy, so to speak. He looks towards it, he sees it's well watered, Kigan Hashem Geretz Mitzrayim, like the garden of the Lord, like the land of Egypt, and he goes there. And then later these malachim, these angels or these messengers, they come to visit him, and they're strangers visiting Sodom. He brings them into his home and sort of presses them to come and receive hospitality in his home, partly perhaps because he's worried about what will happen to them otherwise. And then we have the mob descending on the house. So let's read that pasuk. Okay. So it's Terem Yishkavu ve'anshei ha'ir anshei Sodom nasabu al habayit mina'ar ve'ad zaken kol ha'am mitchatzeh. But before they lay down, the men of the city, the men of Sodom, surrounded the house, both old and young, all the people from every quarter. Okay, so there's an emphasis on the idea of men here. It's anshe ha'ir, anshe Sodom. It repeats the word men twice before it says kol ha'am. Could have just said kol ha'am, all the people, and then you wouldn't know. But it uses the word for men twice. Not only that, actually, it also uses the word yishkavu, which is interesting because that lying down, plural of men lying down, that's how the wording of the prohibition of male homosexual intercourse appears in the Torah. The actual pasuk is, just to read it. Ve'et zachar lo tishkav mishkavei isha to'eva hi. You shall not lie with men as with women. It is a to'eva, but the word mishkavei is like yishkavu. It's the same root of lying down. So we have even more reference there. But the point is, so we have this mob of men, and they say to Lot, "Vayikaru el Lot, vayomeru lo, aye ha'anashim asher ba'u elecha halayla, hotziem elenu v'neda'a otam." So they called to Lot and they said, "Where are these men who came to you in the night? Bring them out to us that we may know them." Now, this "that we may know them," the Torah uses lida'at, the shoresh, or the root of knowledge, to mean knowing things like "I know that you're here," and it also means carnal knowledge, like sexuality, and especially lida'at et usually means carnal sexuality. So there's a very plausible reading of this, where they're saying, "Let them out so that we may rape them, or we may have sexual knowledge of them." And that's confirmed when you go to Sefer Shoftim, the book of Judges, because there's a sort of repeat of this narrative form in the famous story of Pilegesh B'Giv'ah, where now it's a woman who's going to be pushed out the door, and she's raped by a mob and then dies. And what's interesting in that comparison with Sefer Shoftim is that it both confirms the idea that this is a mob that's really out for sexual knowledge, and at the same time also it kind of backs away from the importance of their sexual orientation, right? In this case, it has a homosexual quality because it's a mob of men, and the people who are being demanded are also men. But then in Pilegesh Begiva, when we're talking in Sefer Shoftim, the concubine who becomes the target is not a man. And so Tanakh is making sure to emphasize the problem here, in a sense, is a mob of sexually rapacious men. And they can be out for other men or they can be out for women. In both cases, a mob of sexually rapacious men is the problem. But that can include homosexuality, as it maybe does here. So we can return to that issue in a second, but just to complete the story, right? So then Lot doesn't want to put his guests in danger, but then very puzzlingly, he offers his daughters instead. He says, "Hine na'ali shte vanot asher lo yad'u ish, otzi'a na ethen elechem, ve'asu lahen katov be'enechem, rak la'anashim ha'el al ta'asu davar, ki al ken ba'u betzel korati." So Lot behaves in a baffling way from the standpoint of any reasonable notion of morality, because he says, "Oh no, please don't do such a terrible thing to these visitors. Instead, just take my daughters who've never known a man, but now you can have them. Do what's good in your eyes to them instead." And the mob refuses them, and then they try to find the door. The angels sort of blind them. We know the rest of the story, that Lot and his daughters escape Sodom before it's destroyed. He ends up in a cave with them, all the three of them on their own, and then they think that the whole world has been destroyed and they have to repopulate it. They get him drunk, they lie down with him, they produce children by him, and those two nations are going to be born from their children. Moab and Ben Ami are the two sons, each from one daughter, and so you have Moab and Ammon are the nations that come from them. Now, why is all that significant? Well, so again, we have making harlots out of your daughter, because Lot is offering to push his daughter out the door. We have persecution of strangers. We have an element of homosexuality. We also have the idea of women who haven't known a man. So there's also this sense of prevention of reproduction. We also have the notion of incest appearing. And so there's really like a great deal of elements. And I'll even add, we also have child sacrifice, because Lot is offering his daughters as a sacrifice to the mob. But not even just that, we have Molech sacrifice, if we get to include the rest of Nach. Now, why is that? Because Molech sacrifice turns out to be, as we have from Sefer Malachim in the time of Shlomo HaMelech, we're told it is an idolatry of Ammon. It's an idolatry of the nation Ammon that came from the incestuous union of Lot with his daughter. So Molech sacrifice becomes associated specifically with Ammon and therefore with Lot. And this moment is one where Lot is actually offering his daughter. And we can even further confirm that, because there's also this moment where Yiftach in Sefer Shoftim offers his daughter as a sacrifice, because he says to Hashem, if you give me victory over his enemy in war, which was Ammon, if you give me victory over Ammon, then I will give you as a sacrifice whatever walks through my door. And then it turns out to be his daughter. So there, if we run the threads back and forth between this moment with Lot and Sodom to Sefer Shoftim and Sefer Malachim, Molech sacrifice and daughter sacrifice and Ammon and the incestuous union of Lot and his daughters are all being threaded together into one package. So in a sense, you could say that's the prophetic commentary of Nach on what's being read here in the Torah, and saying this thing that Lot is offering to do with his daughters is not just some kind of wheeling and dealing. It is an instance of child sacrifice, right? We should view it that way. And it's sort of drawing a line under it and saying, notice here what's happening. So we have, again, we've found incest, we found homosexuality, we found persecution of strangers, we found making harlots of one's daughter. We found molech sacrifice or child sacrifice, um, and the idea of non-reproduction. And I'll even add, to cap it all off, how does the story of Lot end? It ends with the destruction of Sodom, where the whole thing becomes salted earth, right? Salted earth is non-fertile. His wife, a woman who was a fertile human being, she becomes a pillar of salt, which is non-living and which is sterilizing even, and which is non-reproductive. So it's all about the end of fertility, the end of reproduction, as the sort of end state of Sodom that is related in a sense to its downfall or its destruction. And that, I think, is what we want now as an explanatory framework for going back to Sefer Vayikra and saying, what are these mitzvot about? What is the Torah really telling us is the risk here? Like, what's the problem with all these different practices? Why are they these Torah that suggest that the land, you're not going to be able to hold on to the land, right? Why is this talked about in terms that have such national and political implications when it seems like they're more these sort of individual sexual transgressions of different kinds that are not necessarily all related, seemingly? So I think that the theme we want to return to is this idea of Anshe Ha'ir, the men of the city, right? The repetition of the word Anshe, of the word men, when it's talking about Sodom, right? Terem Yishkavu Anshe Ha'ir Anshe Ha'ir Anshe Sodom Nasabu al Habayit Minar Ve'ad Zaken Kol Ha'am Mikatzeh. So before they lay down, the men of the city, the men of Sodom, surrounded the house. And then it says, both old and young, all the people from every quarter. Minar ve'ad zaken, kol ha'am, right? There's something here that is about mass democracy, right? It's saying everyone in Sodom, especially every man in Sodom, turned out to vote, so to speak, for what's happening here. This is not an instance where it's just, some bad guys who are roving around and they haven't been dealt with. This has been ratified by the whole city, what is happening. The whole city demands that the mob be given this opportunity to violate these guests of Lot. That, I think, is the thing that you want to really underline here, because go back to how we started. What we said was, who are the most vulnerable people in society? Children and unmarried women, right? That's the Torah's view. We get that very clearly from orphans and widows. And we come into this situation and, and we could have maybe added strangers to that list. They're also the most vulnerable, right? They have no one to look out for them. The Torah also repeatedly talks about the importance of protecting and loving the stranger in addition to orphans and widows. So the strangers here are also vulnerable. But in particular, if orphans and widows are the vulnerable people, meaning unmarried women and children, interestingly, Lot's daughters, who are not yet married, like they haven't known a man, they fit both of those categorizations, right? They are both Lot's children, and it's his job to look out for them. And also, they're not married, so they don't have husbands to look out for them, and he's the only one to look out for them. So there's this attention being paid by the text to how vulnerable daughters are to the abuse of their fathers, right? If their father will not look out for them, no one will look out for them. No one will be capable of protecting them. And of course, we see that most clearly in the mitzvah saying, don't make a harlot of your daughter. Don't sort of sell your daughter into sexual slavery. And that's an easy one to focus on and just say, oh yeah, that's terrible. Don't do that. But it's strung together with all of these other things that don't at first seem directly related, right? Because that doesn't have to do with bestiality, like where a man commits bestiality. What does that have to do with protecting women? Or if two men engage in a sexual act together, what does that have to do with protecting women? But again, we're talking about the political implications for the society as a whole. And we've now read this through the narrative in Sodom. And what the narrative in Sodom is portraying is Lot and his daughters are in the home, and then you have a sexually rapacious mob of men outside the home. And it's not just a mob of some size, it's the whole city, it's all the men. What it's showing is, again, the political implications of having a society where it's possible for individual sexual appetites for non-reproductive sexuality to become a ruling force in the democratic process, so to speak, right? That if you have mass democracy and you affirm the preferences of individuals above everything, and there are no other rules kind of regulating that. The sages say about Sodom that what characterized Sodom was the idea of shali, shali, v'shelcha, shelcha. What's mine is mine and what's yours is yours, right? It's about radical individualism, maybe with respect to property and also with respect to preferences. And the point is that when you take that idea and you follow it to its political conclusions, what you're saying is it's not just that there's a mob outside the door, it's that there's a polity, there's a body politic outside the door that's determining the rules of how the whole society works. And in such a society, the question is, what are the choices available to vulnerable young women, right? What's going to happen to them? And it's not just women, maybe it's also children, it's people, anyone who's kind of on the brink where there might be someone who would see them as a sexual target. And the question is, who's going to be able to protect them? And will the society protect them, or will the society be trying to prey on them? And one has to be, to state this very carefully. This isn't about saying every person in such a society is a predator, so to speak. The text is painting in very bright colors and very broad strokes in order to emphasize a particular message here. What it's saying more so is that when you take individual preference and mass democracy, so to speak, as the highest principle, what are all the men going to do? What are they going to vote for? What is that going to lead to at a collective level? And what the Torah is suggesting is, whether you talk about this in terms of homosexuality or heterosexuality, right? We have the example in Sodom, or maybe there's more of a homosexual element. We have the example in Pilegesh B'Giva in Sefer Shoftim, where there's more of a heterosexual element. Men are sexually rapacious in general, right? Certainly, again, when we're generalizing, which we have to do when we talk about the implications for a mob or a voting bloc, right? Men are sexually rapacious. And also, men might like the idea of getting to pursue sexual satisfaction without needing to take on the responsibilities of being a parent, right? If you only can pursue sexuality in a setting where afterwards you have children that you need to provide for, a wife that you have to protect and provide for, that's a different calculation than if you can pursue the satisfaction and afterwards there's no problem, right? You don't have any burden that comes from that. There's no risk that you're taking. And again, talking in the ancient world, there were different ways of avoiding that risk. But what we are what we're seeing explored in the narrative of Sodom is the focus on the idea that if you have this rapacious mob of men outside the door, that the people who are in danger are especially Lot's daughters, because Lot is just one man. And even if he had his daughter's interest at heart, you could even say, maybe so far he's protected them from Sodom. That's why they haven't been known by a man, because he's sort of been hiding them from the system, from the society. But the problem is that if he hides them from the society, where does that lead? That just leads to incest in a cave, right? If Lot withholds his daughters from the society, then they have no opportunity to produce children. And if they want to produce children, it produces, all the only option they have left is an incestuous relationship. So that is warped and twisted in its own way. But then if he doesn't withhold them, then if the society outside is organized to prioritize the rapacity of men and their desire for sexuality without reproduction and without the responsibility that comes with, then there is something that's just like throwing your daughter to the wolves or making a sacrifice of them if you say, I'm going to live in this society, and now, well, the way the rules of society work, you just let them go out the door, and then whatever opportunities are available to them, those are determined by the democratic process. And who knows what that is, but it's the best of all possible worlds if people are getting to choose, right? The problem with that is that it can be that the net effect is that the ways of operating of such a society leave women very few options, right? And may put a lot more pressure on them to, in some ways, act like more of a harlot, or be in a situation where more is expected of them in terms of sexuality, without there being the possibility of marriage and a promise of support and protection, and the emphasis on the goal of reproduction within a family that has shared responsibility. So I think that is what we're getting out of this in the end, is that if we're going back to this question of what is it about the societies of the Canaanim that made them collapse, or that made them vulnerable and brittle, that made them unable to hold on to the land, what is it about Bnei Israel that if they plug into all these same to'evot and legitimate all these same practices, what's going to make the land spew them out? I think part of the point is that the land of Israel is hard to hold on to on any day of the week. It's at the crossroads of three continents. You have the Greeks and the Romans coming from Europe. You have the Persians and the Babylonians coming from the east. You have the Egyptians coming from the southwest, and it's just this place where these titanic forces collide. And so you need to have a very cantankerous and resilient, thriving society in order to hold on to the land. But what happens to Sodom, right? Sodom ends in sterility. Why does Sodom end in sterility? Because the core of the essence of what Sodom is, as we said, is represented by the emblem of child sacrifice to Molech. You offer your seed as a sacrifice to Molech. In other words, you destroy the future for the sake of some kind of transaction in the present, because that's what child sacrifice looks like when we focus on the sort of the end of the line, or the end of one's seed, as a way of bargaining with or propitiating a false god. And so that's the one that's most emblematic of what we're talking about here. But then we see it in all these other examples with all these other mitzvot, that it's like, if you have a society where you just say about all these different ways of seeking sexual gratification without reproduction, go ahead, it's fine, it's not a problem. Any given one of those acts at one moment, it's hard to point to someone and say, look, you're destroying the whole society, look what's happening. It can look like no one is being harmed, and people make that kind of argument. But when it becomes, as we say, the fishbowl that all the fish are swimming in, when it becomes the ethos of the society, like it did in Sodom, that's what ends in salted earth. Because when you say that the purpose of a society is the gratification of individuals and their desires, and it's not about responsibility, it's not about creation of a future and making the painful sacrifices of your own comfort in the present in order to secure that future. In other words, raising children and doing all the things that are difficult with that, having responsibility to the people who bear your children, etc., right? To the women who bear your children. The point is, in such a society, when you give all of that up, what the text is showing us is the two things that happen are that vulnerable women become a sacrifice, they become targets, they become prey for the rapacity of men who are looking to benefit from the fact that they can be gratified without having to assume responsibility. And again, that obviously, I think what's one of the things that's confusing is that sounds like, but that has nothing to do with homosexuality. But again, the text is using homosexuality simply as an emblem, another one of these lists, or items on a list to say, here's an example of how men who have a sexual appetite can pursue it in a way that's not reproductive. So the point is that it and it's an example of the same principle that runs through these different practices. But ultimately, when we say women are vulnerable, they're going to be vulnerable to the predations of men who want women for sexual gratification, obviously. So that's one of the things that happens, is that women become much more vulnerable. And the other thing that happens is that there is no future, right? The society becomes sterile. No one is having children. Men are released from the responsibility of taking care of children as a kind of thing they have to shoulder in order to pursue their sexual appetites. And when you do that, you create a situation where everyone has an easy time saying, you know what, actually having children is pretty difficult. Why don't I focus on, what gratifies me? And even women can do that to some degree, because having children is frightening and painful and all of that else. And so once you create a society where everyone gets to make that choice, you don't create the future. You've burned up the seed, so to speak, as like in child sacrifice to Molech. And those societies aren't thriving, and they aren't resilient. They are brittle, and they are conquerable. And so that may, to some degree, be what happens in Canaan, and also, what Bnei Israel have to worry will happen to them if they go that same route.